start, right?
Yep. Okay. So to get started with our birch painting today, what you're going to need is masking tape. We're going to put a couple of strips onto a cutting board or some surface that you can cut on, and we're going to take an X-Acto knife and we're going to actually cut the tape into the birch trees and use those to mask them out on our paper. So what I'm going to do is start up and cut a diagonal from the top to the bottom of this strip of tape to make my birch trees. And we're going to need 5 for this painting. So you just cut right on down. So you've got fat and skinny at either end. Then I'm going to take the tape and I'm going to randomly place it, kind of scatter the bottom a little bit, make it so it's not definitely even. And you're going to secure it onto your paper. And this is how we're going to mask out our trees so we can paint our background and not worry about them. If you want to give them a little bit of a bend as you put them down, just take your tape and as you pull it towards the top, kind of curve it, and as you run your thumb up, you can secure it down so you can get a little bit of a curve going through the tape. So here is our birch trees. Then next what I'd like you to do is secure the paper down because we're going to be wetting it to paint the sky and the tree background, the horizons, and I find it just keeps the paper flat, more easily controllable so you don't have to worry about the paper curving for you at all as you're painting. So let me tape this down quick. And I recommend masking tape just because it stays more securely to your paper, the adhesion, instead of having the blue painter's tape, because that will sometimes allow the water to seep underneath. It works when you're doing your home, but it's not necessarily good on working with the watercolor. You're going to be using that throughout the whole painting. So you're going to take Antwerp blue, put a little water into your palette if your paint has dried. A nice puddle of it, because we're using it for the sky, we're using it for the birches. So pull that out and using some additional water, get that out of your brush. We use a little bit of the neutral tint to tone down the brightness of the Antwerp blue so it's a little more gray. So you've got more of a gray wintry sky. It's not as bright. And as you can see, I've had some paint ready. So I've got plenty in here. And as soon as you've got that mixed, set your palette aside. So the first step you always do is get your paints ready before you wet the paper down, because otherwise your paper will start drying and you won't get the effects that you want to achieve with the painting. So next what I'm going to do is take just some clear water and I'm going to paint up probably about 1 inch or 2 from the bottom, because this is the first background or first horizon mark. You're going to angle up and give yourself a further horizon on your paper. And then just go ahead and paint, fill that in, get it all wet. You don't want it real puddly, you just want it nice and moist. So there's a good, just a larger plain brush, another flat brush to get it wet. I just find it's easier so I don't have to keep washing the paint off of my paintbrush all the time. Got it nice and wet. You can see I've got a bit of a shine across the whole page, which is what you want. And then taking your brush with the blue paint, your kind of half area of where you've gotten, and let the paint run some. And you can see I've got this taped just to a piece of plywood. If you've got a cutting board or a piece of plexiglass or next to a piece of countertop, just something that you're able to adhere this to. Then you're going to take a paper towel or a tissue, not anything with a lotion in it, just the plain paper towel. If you want to clean up some of the paint that's maybe running along your trunk of the trees, this is how you kind of achieve the clouds. And what's fun about this is it still gives the paper a chance to work the paint, and it'll still move somewhat on its own to soften up those edges. Now, the next step we're going to go ahead and do is the tree line. And what you're going to do is take your 1 inch flat brush and you're going to stand it up on end, and you're going to, it doesn't have to go all the way down to the bottom of your waterline, but keep track of where that is. And then I like to usually give it a little twist or an angle to get kind of a nice finish to this. Is then clean off your brush. You're going to take a little bit of the alizarin crimson on one corner, and you're going to kind of follow the bottom edge where you've left some gaps. If you want some interest in the tree, sprinkle some salt. Just along where the alizarin crimson is on your tree line, and it kind of gives it a frosty, sort of a distant look to it. So we're going to just sprinkle some kosher or margarita salt along the bottom edge, and then before you're finished, you're not quite done yet, with this step, we're going to grab some more of our blue. That's why we had to make so much. And you're going to put in another tree line edge here. Now this is up close, it's a little bigger, so you don't have to really tap it all in like you did here. You'll want to find the edge, but then you can go in with your brush and just fill it in some and take it to the bottom edge of your waterline there. And again, I just kind of taper it off. It gives a little bit more of a natural finish. And clean off your brush once again. Grab a little bit more alizarin crimson on the corner, and you're going to tap that along the bottom. It seems so bright and really intense, but once you get the salt on, it really does diffuse. Oops, what you got going on here. And then again with the salt. Now depending on how wet or how dry this area is, you do have to have some moisture to get the salt to react, but if you've got too much water, it's going to be a lot larger bloom of reacting when the salt is absorbing and taking up some of that moisture, or it'll be more of a sparkly finish, a little more crystallized if it's a more dry the paint is when you're putting the salt on there. So we'll let this dry then. Got to get our salt to set before we can do anything else with the birches. Okay, now while we're waiting for that to dry a little bit more, I'm going to go ahead and develop the shadows at the base of the birches so they kind of are not floating in the scene here. We'll put some shading down, a little bit of snow drifting to get them to hold their base down here. And it's just a nice place to stop again too and let everything else finish drying before we move ahead. So using a round brush, the number 10 round, I'm going to pick up some more of my blue paint and develop a little bit of a base here, kind of painting around the bottom, and I'm going to drag out a couple of my tree shadows. And I don't mind having some of this scrape look because it looks like it's the snow, kind of a crusty, crystallized bit, so it gives some crunch to it, some texture. And I'm going to go ahead with a few of these. Now, you don't want to drag all of them out, just a couple. But when you do draw the shadow out, make sure you're drawing them at the same angle, because if you change it, it's going to kind of give it a time-lapse look, so you don't want to have that as you go forward with your painting. You want to let them know it's all done at the same time. So I'm going to paint some of this in, and then using just some water, you can blend or soften some of your edges a little bit. I usually like using 2 containers of water because you'll have one that can be used for rinsing your brush and kind of your dirty one, and then you'll always have some clean water, and eventually you have to just kind of trade the 2 out. So, all right, there we go. So we're going to let that all dry then. Some people like to rush this a little bit or like to work a little more quickly. Once your salt is starting to develop, and you can see in here I'm getting some of that pattern from the salt crystals on there, you could use a hairdryer on here if you want. But I truly believe watercolor is a practice of patience. Put it on, let it dry. If you have some other things you need to do out and about, go ahead, come back, and you can pick up where you are or where you've left off. The great thing about watercolors is if the paint does dry, you just need to add a little bit of water to your palette to get the paint rejuvenated again. And even if you have to run off and you leave paint on your paintbrush, it's okay, it will not get wrecked because you just have to re-moisten it or else wash it off later. But it's not like any of the other oils or acrylics where your brush will get ruined if you leave the water or the paint on it. So we'll just let that dry and then move on to the next step. Now that the salt is all dry, our background is all finished, I've gone ahead and rubbed off the salt crystals. Once your painting is dry, you can rub off that salt. I don't necessarily recommend rubbing on your floor unless you want to vacuum that up too later, but go ahead and remove all that. We still have our blue paint that we've pre-mixed. The next step we're going to do here is we're going to take a little bit of our alizarin crimson that we used in the background, and we're going to put that out on the palette with a little bit of neutral tint so it's not so bright, so it kind of makes it a little more burgundy-like. And then I'm going to also do the same with some sap green. These are just kind of some little extra color to add to the birch trees. Give them a little bit more interest there. And again, a little bit of... Now I've gone ahead and started here just to get a few of them going. What we use next is like a piece of credit card or a gift card if you want to cut it into strip. unless you have some sort of a flexible but yet firm plastic. If you're using a heavy cardboard, it's going to eventually get ruined. You're not going to get that same effect. But we're going to use the credit card to paint our birch trees. Now I am left-handed, so I worked from the right-hand side of my tree, and I've worked from the right side of my paper. If you are right-handed, you're going to want to be dragging your paint from the left side of the tree, and you're going to start from the center of your paper from here on the tree as you peel them off, because it just is a little more easily dragged instead of trying to curve it this way. I've given it a little bit of a curve to give some dimension to the tree as I go along. Now to start with, you do peel up the masking tape. If for beginners and just to be able to eyeball it a little bit, I'll leave the tape here to still give you an area or an idea of what the width of the trunk is, because you see we've got that white area, and it'll make it a little bit more comfortable for you to be able to drag that across and know where you're finishing. So what you'll do is dip the credit card in your blue paint, and then you're going to place it on the edge, and you're going to drag it firmly, giving a little bit of a curve, see, across the tree, and that's how we're getting the texture and just sort of that rough birch finish for the bark and the texture on there. What I'm going to do right now as I move up here with this masking tape is you can take your credit card dipped and just kind of dot it along the edge, and it gives you that indication of the birch with the snow in the background. But you don't necessarily want to drag a line. Just give it a few dots. It's enough of a suggestion to let people know that there is a trunk there and it's kind of a finished edge. And I'm going to continue dragging. I'm going to grab a little bit of the alizarin crimson and just add some extra texture and color. I always feel like the bottom of the birches are your darkest. Things broke off as they were growing and they're young, so I usually try and put some different variations of color here and there. You just kind of work your way up the tree trunk, and you can get as more sparse or heavy, however you want to. These are your trees. Neat. There we go. So we're going to put on the edge, and then I'll go in and I'll pick up some of these other colors just to add some interest. And you can either layer it on top to make it heavier. You can give it a little bit more, fill in some more of the gaps if you'd rather. Just fun effect here. And you'll do that across all 5 of your trees. Once you've completed all the trees, we're going to work a little bit on the snowdrift. Some indications of some snow out here in the distance. It has a big snow-covered lake that's passing off in the distance, and we've got some distant trees in the background. So what I'm going to have you do is take your flat brush, pick up some clean water, and we're going to put in a couple of drifts. And to do that, pick out an area, decide how you want to do that, and you'll drag your brush across just to give yourself a wet line that would be indicating a snowdrift. And what we're going to do is take some of our blue paint, and following along the bottom, you're going to follow that with your blue paint. Now what we're actually going to end up doing here, you'll start picking up some water in your brown brush, and start a shadow, and gradually it's working its way away from you. So you'll see just right at the edge of the snowdrift, and then it gradually fades away. So it's kind of a nice hint of a shadow. Now, one thing I didn't mention earlier is when you paint with watercolors, as they dry, they probably dry about 25% lighter than when you put them on. So you may think at some time it's like, oh my gosh, this is so dark. Well, it actually does end up lightening somewhat as it gets, as it goes along and dries. I'm going to put another drift in the front here because we do use that for one of our other clump of grasses that we have later on in the painting. I'm going to again pick up some more blue, and see, and I just follow along the bottom edge. And that's what keeps it so nice and smooth, because it's right along that water. And then I'll go in again with my paintbrush and my trusty paper towel and just start to pick up some of that excess. What's nice about this is you can lift a little bit while it's still wet to any corrections if you get a little crazy with your brush there like I've been doing. I'm just kind of using water and using my brush and just picking up some of that excess that has fanned off onto the water, just to kind of keep a little bit more control there. And you'll let that dry. There we go. And you could put more. If you ended up having a larger area in the back here between your horizon and your tree, if you want to put something back in there, that's perfectly fine. Just if you feel, if you want some smaller little spots, but that's basically what we've done for the painting today, is just a couple of small drifts. All right, now off to I'm keeping this in here, all right?
Yep.
I'm not good, okay. And it's odd because I'm so used to, okay, now look at this, and then, but we'll show them a picture later. All right. Now we're going to start working with the birch branches. Birch trees, when you see them out in nature, there are lots of branches on them. So it can get kind of crazy. What I recommend when you're doing your trees is probably about 5 branches per off the page, because it really helps make it appear that the birches are part of the painting. They're not just floating off someplace. It really does make a difference to have the paper. Again, using our blue, I've moved on to the number 5 or 6 round. It's a smaller brush. It's a little more controllable. I know with my larger brush it comes to a nice point. You can use that, but I just figuring with beginning painting it's just a little easier to use the smaller round. So what I'm going to do is take a first one off here. You can see I've started a few. Just paint off a branch off of the page, just to kind of establish them a little bit. You can have your branches reach across just from the side of the tree. You can have some come out from the front. When I'm doing it from the front, I'll give a little bit of an board, and you can go ahead and just start to drag get a nice light finish to the end, a light point. You don't want to necessarily have them all blunt expanse of branch that you're having reach out, which I do recommend. It helps just to spread them out a little bit more. Make sure that the branch is weighted to do so. If it's a real long skinny branch, it might not look right. See, I've gotten some that are a little heavier than others. It just helps manage that width that you're running it through. What's kind of fun, if you want to go into the detail a little bit more, you can see some of the birches are more forward than the others. That means these branches could go across the fronts of the other ones. But then it also makes it fun too when you got them behind to take the time to have them drag behind. It's totally up to you. You can have them all just go wherever you want. Does not matter, but it's just kind of a fun little detail to add if you want to get this finished, or to have it a little bit more thought put into it. Let's see here, I can just take a few of these off the side of the tree. Bring them out again, lifting my branches. Okay, to do something else here. Oops. And if I don't like what's going on, I can go ahead with my paper towel and kind of lift some of that extra off. Just bring that in here. Make sure it comes to a point. Better control that way. I don't know if you've noticed, or you can tell, I like to have, I think I told you about the 2 water containers. That way you have some clean water readily available. Sometimes it gets a little crazy to try and figure out where you're going to put those branches. If you feel you've got enough, just go ahead and stop. You don't need to do the 5. You just need something to give it that natural kind of overdone look. They're so long and they get so spread out. What'll be fun too is we're going to do a little bit with seed pods. You notice the sprinkle that we've got on some of these branches, and it just gives it a little bit more depth, a little bit more life to the painting. A little more fun. Okay, maybe we'll stop at that point. Okay, next what I'm going to do is go ahead and grab my round again, my number 10 round, and I'm going to start on this little area down in here. There's a little clump of some grasses, I always picture it as like a spot where maybe a tree trunk has come off, and with the snow, it stays protected so the grasses can still kind of perk up through. I grab a little bit of all the colors that we've used in the painting, the green, the alizarin crimson, the blue, and I make kind of a little base at the bottom, sort of like I'm laying out a fire pit or whatever, just something to have it come through to grow on from, and then I'll sprinkle this with salt. So it does look a little intense in color sometimes to the rest of the painting, but if you just sprinkle the whole thing with salt, and we'll let that dry. And then when it's all finished, we can go back in and put in maybe started to grow from that stump of a trunk from the tree, and put a little bit of my salt back in towards that center. The next step here, and kind of the finishing step as we're waiting for that to dry, is we're going to go ahead and sprinkle what looks like the little seed pods from the birch tree. All right, so what we're going to do is, using the alizarin crimson, we're going to, again, kind of like what we did with the blue, just make a nice big puddle. But it has to kind of have a lot of pigment, but you want it fluid so that it will splatter off of your brush. So I'm going to go ahead and just make a bunch of this red. And I just added it onto the spot where we have a little bit of neutral tint mixed in, and that's just fine. So I'm going to take my paintbrush, and I'm going to take another one so I can tap it against it, and I'll hold it over the top of this, and I'm going to start to splatter a little bit. Now you may want to take some paper towel or scraps of paper to help kind of protect the area of your painting that you don't want splattering on. But if you don't go too wild and tapping too hard, if you've got just the right amount of moisture here in your paint, you should be able to do it without having to cover the painting. Then what I'm going to do is take my mister, because you can see all the little red dots here, and to make some of them kind of blossom or bloom, I'm going to give it a little bit of a mist. See, it's making the colors kind of explode, which is sort of fun. Not too much, you don't want it totally drenched, but it's just fun to be able to have that on to give it just a nice little effect to the painting. There we go. So that's how we finish our winter birches. Oops, we'll let that dry. And then once that's dry, you'll brush the salt off like you did on the rest of the trees here. And then you'll be all finished with that painting. Buds, we'll let that dry. And while we're doing that, let me show you how to put a little bunny into the painting, if that's what you'd like to do. I have some students that don't care to because the bunnies eat up their plants in their gardens, but in this case I'll show you how to do that, and then you can decide on your own. So what we'll do is we're going to take burnt sienna, which is a brown, and I'm going to get it over here on the page. I'm going to take a little bit of my blue to kind of gray down the paint so it's not too bright. The brown isn't such a bright orangey. See, just kind of tone it down a little bit. This particular rabbit, so we're going to do a little bunny. It's very easy to sketch in. It's just a couple of U's basically. Sitting there in the snow, if it's not in its own shadow there, you can develop a shadow. You don't want to have it floating. Anything that's here. Mixed up my brown and blue. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to dot in the color. I'm not going to paint it in solid. If you want, you can leave a little indication if it's got little. And then what I do next is I take my paper towel and I give it a dab. And what's kind of fun is you still get some of that texture. It's not a solid, it's not a solid painted spot, but it also gives just a little bit of a hint of maybe some shading naturally there just by dabbing off your paint. Looks like it's got two tails, so we're going to take one of those off. There we go. And then once it's dried, you're going to go back in and kind of do the same thing with your blue paint that we've been using throughout the whole painting. We're going to take the blue, and again, once it's dried, I might be a little early here, even with the tapping, you're going to want to give it a little indication of some shadow just on its shape. And you can tell where your light source is coming from basically by how you've shaded. So since you drag the shadows of your birches out to the left, you're going to do the same thing with your rabbit. You're going to put the shadows on the rabbit to the left. and then again hit it up with the paper towel. So you can see how you're getting that indication of some shaping without actually coming in and doing it, and it's not as defined. There's just a little extra effect to have on your painting. If you want, you can put in a second one, how many you want to do, but it's just sort of a fun little extra touch to have it here. So one thing I want to mention too, and I don't know if you've noticed when I've been painting, wherever your palette is, have your water by your palette, because otherwise you need to reach across your painting for water and paint, and you could possibly splash or drop on it. So wherever you have your palette, if you're right or left-handed, make sure your water is near your palette so you don't have to reach across your painting.